what is known as a checkout. I check the systems to make sure everything is the way it should be. And only if everything is in order at this point do I perform a translunar injection burn. If I want to go to the moon, here's the burn. I need greater speed in the form of a second cosmic velocity. I leave the Earth's field of gravity and head for the moon. The region up to the moon is known as cislunar space. I could also fly to Jupiter. Then I would be in translunar space. I might even want to leave the solar system entirely, but then I would need an even greater velocity.
The current Soyuz carrier rocket looks little different from the rocket that once took Yuri Gagarin into Earth orbit. And even today, every launch of a space rocket still involves enormous technological effort and, above all, financial cost. The flight to the space station costs up to 150 million euros. And even today, every flight with a rocket is a major and also risky adventure.
You don't really believe it until the rocket actually lifts off. About 3.5 hours before the launch, you board this bus, which takes you to the launch pad. There you say goodbye to a small group of people. In my case, my father was also there. Then you're standing in front of this monster, which is hissing and snarling as if it were alive. The tanks are full of kerosene and liquid oxygen, and on the outside, clouds of vapor roll down as the moisture condenses in the cold air. Unlike in the US, in Russia, there's no countdown. You know in advance the precise minute and second when the rocket will lift off. Then the turbopumps are activated. When the main engines are ignited, you feel a slight vibration. Then the rocket takes off. At that moment, you know that it's really true. You're now on a journey into space. You're protected by a pressure suit. The suit's visors are closed. You actually hear the suit's ventilation more than anything else. But obviously you have radio contact with ground control. They give you regular information on how the flight is progressing. You keep a watch on the data from the life support system. If there were a leak somewhere, you would have to react immediately. Otherwise, you don't actually hear anything of the infernal noise in the capsule.
In 1995, Thomas Reiter's first flight into space was to the Russian space station Mir. The journey took the three-man crew 2 days. Docking the Soyuz spaceship onto the Mir was precision work. Space station and capsule were hurtling around the Earth at 28,000 kilometers an hour at a height of around 400 kilometers. Soyuz has control thrusters and its own small rocket engine. Developed in the 1960s, it has hardly changed. Only the computers have become more modern, robust Russian technology.
We're talking about different philosophies. Most Russian rockets have liquid propulsion. Soyuz, for example, flies on kerosene and oxygen. This is comparatively old technology, which goes back to what was developed in Peenemünde during World War II.
And liftoff.
The Japanese use a combination of liquid hydrogen and oxygen as their core propulsion and solid fuel boosters. The same system in Europe, solid fuel boosters for the central thrust and liquid propulsion for the main stage and the upper stage, simply because the performance is better.
The combination of liquid fuel engines and solid fuel boosters was also used for the space shuttle. The space transporters were in service for 30 years. Then the program was shut down. The shuttle's last flight into space was in 2011.
Derzeit bewegen wir uns ins All.
At present, we travel through space with totally standard rocket technology, based in the final analysis on as much mass as possible being expelled downwards, with as high a speed as possible, and the rocket heading upwards into space.
So der Antrieb, den man sich auch vorstellen würde.
This is the kind of propulsion you think of when you build a rocket as a child.
Genauso. Und dieser Antrieb.
By and large, this form of propulsion has been maxed out. The chemical limit has already been reached.
Die chemische Grenze, die hat man schon erreicht.
NASA's new spaceship is also based on old concepts. The Orion is designed to replace the space shuttle and transport astronauts and freight into orbit. More than that, it is the space vehicle with which the Americans first want to return to the moon, later fly to Mars. The spaceship is being built in cooperation with the European Space Agency, ESA. Orion can be equipped for different mission profiles and fitted with its own propulsion and supply modules. There is room on board for up to 6 astronauts. For missions to the Moon or Mars, the aim is for further modules to dock onto the capsule in Earth orbit, a spacecraft designed along modular construction lines.
Interface, the moment of truth for Orion for the next 9 minutes, 45 seconds.
In 2014, Orion took off on its first trial flight. Re-entry into the atmosphere was the acid test for the capsule's heat shield. These pictures remind us of the return of lunar capsules in the 60s and 70s. Just like capsules in those days after hurtling through the atmosphere, the Orion was first slowed down by parachutes and then splashed into the Pacific. The unmanned maiden flight was a success, an initial step in the direction of Mars. As with the Apollo capsules in the past, the task of recovering Orion in the ocean was handled by the US Navy. The launch vehicle for Orion is the Delta IV Heavy. After their moon rocket, it is the biggest launch vehicle ever built by the Americans.
We won't be able to reduce rocket size by very much. To get anywhere in space, we need big rockets. We will never fly into space with a mini rocket.
The engines can be optimized, but the principle always remains the same.
To fly into space, you need a lot of thrust. The more, the better. But what is thrust? And how does it work? A lot of people think thrust just isn't possible in space because thrust means pushing off against something. But in space, there is nothing to push off against, like a wall, for instance. So how does thrust work in space? Let's start with a simple example. Imagine I'm sitting in a small rowing boat. Each time I row, I push myself off against the water with my oars. This gives me thrust in the opposite direction. But what I push off against doesn't have to be solid or liquid. I can achieve the same effect by throwing something. If, for instance, I stand up and throw a stone over the back of the boat, I'm actually pushing off against the stone as I throw it. How great is the thrust in that case? That depends on the weight of the stone. The heavier the stone, the more powerful the thrust. The speed of the throw also matters. So speed and mass determine the backward force. And energy is not involved. It plays no role whatsoever. People think that thrust is energy. No, it's mass. As much mass as possible, as fast as possible. In this respect, thrust can come in totally different forms. Take a look at this. Here, a man is expelling a lot of water backwards at great speed. This generates counter-thrust, thrust upwards. That, too, is a principle behind a rocket. And we can go even further. Let's actually take a rocket. With a rocket, gas is hurled downwards. That is a lot of mass. You just don't see it because it's gaseous. But the rocket pushes off against this gas and is thrust upwards. So it's quite clear that this can also function in space. I shoot gas out backwards and can move in this direction. And if I want to travel in this direction, I again shoot it out backwards. That's the thrust principle in space.
The thrust principle can be applied not only for taking off and flying, but also for landing. Several private companies in America are working on this technology. The Falcon 9, built by the US company SpaceX, has already landed successfully after flights into space. And with the Falcon Heavy, SpaceX is already working on a bigger version. 3 propulsion stages will lift a payload of 53 tons into space. They could also transport 14 tons to Mars, because SpaceX is also thinking about the journey to our neighbor planet. When the payload has been deposited in space or the spacecraft released, the rockets return to Earth independently and can be reused. That is the plan. With this principle, SpaceX plans to dramatically lower the cost of transporting men and material into space, and thus develop a lucrative business.
If you look at, say, the cost of a Falcon 9 rocket, which is quite a big rocket, it's about 1 million pounds of thrust, and it is the lowest cost rocket in the world, and even so, it's about $50 to $60 million. But the cost of the fuel and oxygen and so forth is only about $200,000. So obviously, if we can reuse the rocket, say 1,000 times, then that would make the capital cost of the rocket per launch only about $50,000.